Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, as you well know, Congress is now engaged in a debate of huge consequence, and that is the budget. And the budget of a nation, like the budget of a family, expresses who we are as a people and what our priorities are. Where you spend your money, where you make your investments, tells you everything about what we believe in. I am more than aware that this country faces a $1.6 trillion deficit and a $14 trillion national debt. And these are enormously important issues, but they're issues that have to be dealt with in a sensible way, and they're issues that have to be dealt with within a broader context. So I think the very first question that we have to ask, Mr. President, is how did we get to where we are today? Is the problem, in fact, that we spend too much money on Head Start and child care, that we just shower so much on our children, or is the converse the truth, and that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth? How did we get into the deficit? Well, let me tick it off. And when we discuss how we got into the deficit situation, the irony here is that those people who are yelling loudest about the deficit, who are fighting hardest to make savage and draconic cuts on basic programs, are precisely the people who led us to where we are today. Mr. President, I voted against the war in Iraq for a number of reasons. One of them being that it wasn't paid for. Do you happen to recall, as we went into the war in Iraq, which will end up costing us about $3 trillion by the time we take care of our last veteran, do you recall much discussion about how that war was going to be paid for? In fact, do you remember one word of how that war was going to be paid for? I don't remember that. I was in the middle of that debate. $3 trillion. And no one said, oh, we can't afford it. Mr. President, when the crooks on Wall Street, through their illegal behavior, their reckless behavior, drove this country into the recession we are in right now, and they came begging to the Congress for their welfare check of some $800 billion, do you recall too many of the people who voted for that saying, gee, we can't afford to do it. It's going to drive up the deficit. How are we going to provide Wall Street with an $800 billion bailout? I don't recall that discussion. And when I was in the House a number of years ago, Congress passed an initiative from President Bush for a Medicare Part D prescription drug program. I believe that seniors must have prescription drugs, but not that legislation which was written by the insurance companies and the drug companies, and it was not paid for. When our Republican friends fought vigorously for tax breaks for billionaires, which would result in significantly less money coming into the Treasury, driving up the deficit, do you recall much discussion about how we were going to pay for that? I don't recall that discussion. So I find it ironic that when you give tax breaks to billionaires, no worry about the deficit. When you bail out Wall Street, no worry about the deficit. But suddenly, when you provide child care to low-income children who are in desperate need of help in the midst of a recession, suddenly everybody is concerned about the deficit. Frankly, Mr. President, I call that absolute hypocrisy. It is hypocrisy to say that we can give tax breaks to billionaires and not worry about the deficit, but we have to cut back on the needs of working families, the middle class, the sick, the poor, the elderly. Mr. President, this country at this particular moment has got to make some very basic decisions. And the decisions that we make whether in the midst of this horrendous recession, when the middle class is hurting, when poverty is increasing, do we really go after, as our Republican friends in the House want us to do, programs that are virtually life and death for millions and millions of working class and lower income people. Now, Mr. President, I don't know about West Virginia, but I can tell you that in Vermont, it is very, very hard for working families to get adequate and affordable and good quality child care, early education for their kids. It is a major, major problem all over this country. And yet our Republican friends say we should balance the budget by cutting Head Start $1.1 billion, a 20% cut from 2010, and throwing over 200,000 kids off of Head Start. Now, if you're a working mom who sends your kid to Head Start now, feels pretty good that your kid is getting a good quality early childhood education, getting nourishment. They feed the kids. They watch these kids for health care problems. We're going to throw over 200,000 kids off of Head Start. Mr. President, I work very hard to expand the Community Health Center program, which I know is so important in West Virginia and Vermont. You and I argue about which state has greater coverage, but it is enormously important all over this country. A few years ago, about 20 million people were accessing Community Health Center program. We are now working so that in 5 years, 40 million Americans will be able to walk in the door regardless of their income, get health care, dental care, low-cost prescription drugs, mental health counseling. It is working. President Obama has been very, very strong on this issue. Secretary of HHS, Kathleen Sebelius, has been very, very strong on this issue. It is working. And here's the irony. When we give people good quality primary health care, they don't have to go to the emergency room. The emergency room costs 10 times more than treatment at a community health center. When you open the doors for primary health care, people will not get very sick. They don't end up in the hospital. Study after study shows that when you invest in community health centers, you save the taxpayer money. You save Medicaid money. You save Medicare money because people have access to medical care when they need it. The Republican House wants to cut community health centers by $1.3 billion, denying 11 million Americans the opportunity to receive the health care that they need. Mr. President, in my office, and I'm sure all over this country, people who are applying for disability help, for Social Security, are upset about how long the process takes. Our Republican friends want to make major cuts in the Social Security Administration, which means that 500,000 people are going to find delays in getting their claims processed. Everybody in America knows that one of the great problems that we face is the expense of college. We know that hundreds of thousands of bright young people can't even afford to go to college. We know that many people are graduating college deeply in debt. And one of the accomplishments that we've managed to bring about in the last few years is to significantly expand the Pell Grant program so that low and moderate income families would find it easier to send their kids to college. Our Republican friends in the House have decided in their wisdom that what they want to do is reduce by 17% Pell Grants, which means that 9.4 million lower-income college students would lose some or all of their Pell Grants. Here we are trying to compete with the rest of the world. We are falling, in many cases, further and further behind in terms of the percentage of our young people graduating college. College costs are soaring, and the Republican solution is to cut the major program, which makes it easier for working families to send their kids to college. Community Services Block Grant Program is the infrastructure by which we get emergency services, food, help to pay for emergency services for lower income people, housing needs, making sure that people keep the electricity on. That would be decimated by the Republicans. In the midst of a recession, what they want to do is to cut $2 billion from the Workforce Investment Act and other job training programs when we desperately need that job training to make sure that our people can get the jobs that are out there and are available. And often don't have the skills to do that. My point, Mr. President, is a pretty simple one, that as a nation we've got to make some choices, and here are the choices. The top 1% today are doing phenomenally well. That's the fact. Our friends in Wall Street, whom we bailed out, are now making more money than they did before they caused this recession. Top 1% now earns about 23% of all income in America, more than the bottom 50%. The top 1%, the richest people in America, in terms of their effective tax rate, what they really pay, is now lower than at any time in memory. So you got the wealthy doing phenomenally well, tax rates going down, we have showered huge tax breaks on them, and then we say to balance the budget, we have to cut programs for nutrition for our kids, Social Security Administration, Pell Grants, Head Start, and many, many other programs which millions of people depend upon. So the question that we as Americans have got to decide is, when the rich get richer, do we give them more tax breaks while the poor get poorer and we cut programs for them? Well, I don't think, frankly, that that is what the American people want. Mr. President, you may have seen there was a poll just came out, I think it was yesterday or today. It was an NBC News and Wall Street Journal poll. And the questions dealt with the deficit and how the American people think we should go forward in dealing with the deficit. And here are some interesting results. When asked what do Americans want the federal government to do to reduce the deficit, the largest, highest percentage came down in saying that it is totally acceptable or mostly acceptable to impose a surtax on millionaires to reduce the deficit. 81% of the American people said that, for obvious reasons. Rich are getting richer. Given the choice to ask people who have received huge tax breaks, who are already doing very well, to pay a little bit more in taxes or to cut programs that working families need, the choice is not terribly hard. 74% of the American people believe it is totally acceptable or mostly acceptable to eliminate tax credits for the oil and gas industry. 68% of the American public believe it is totally acceptable or mostly acceptable to phase out the Bush tax cuts for families earning over $250,000 a year, et cetera, et cetera. So what the American people are saying in this poll, and I believe all over this country, is kind of obvious. Given the choice of decimating programs that working families depend upon, or asking the wealthiest people in this country who have been receiving huge amounts of tax breaks to start paying their fair share, it ain't a tough answer. And the answer the American people are saying is, you cannot move toward a balanced budget just by cutting, cutting, and cutting. A budget has two parts. Everybody in America understands that. It is the money you spend, it is the money that comes in. And in the case of the United States government, we have got to address our budget deficit in both ways. We have to raise revenue, and you do that, I think, primarily by asking the wealthiest people in this country to pay a little bit more in taxes. And yes, you do have to cut some programs. I think there's waste out there. I think there are programs that can and should be cut. That's what you do. You don't just cut, and then give tax breaks to the very wealthiest people in this country. Now, Mr. President, we have, as the Senate, along with our friends in the House, the responsibility, the constitutional responsibility of coming up with a budget. And I certainly hope that the President intends to play an active role in this, and I hope that the President is prepared to do the right thing and to understand that revenue, asking the wealthiest people in this country to start paying their fair share of taxes, is one important component of how we move forward toward a balanced budget. But if the President chooses not to participate, or if the President chooses not to take that avenue, that does not mean to say that we in the Senate should not go forward. So I would hope, Mr. President, and I intend to work as hard as I can to come up with a deficit reduction program which is fair, but which is responsible. And being responsible means it includes revenue and not just cuts. And there are a whole lot of ways that we can bring in revenue in a fair and progressive way. It's not only asking the wealthiest people in this country to pay their fair share of taxes, it's ending abusive and illegal offshore tax shelters. Do you know that according to a number of studies, we will lose $100 billion this year because corporations and wealthy individuals are stashing their money in tax havens in the Cayman Islands and in Bermuda? Well, you know what? Before you cut nutrition programs for pregnant women, maybe we do away with those tax havens, Mr. President, we have got to begin the process of ending tax breaks for big oil and gas companies. ExxonMobil, the most profitable corporation in the history of the world, not only paid nothing in federal income taxes in 2009, but they received a $156 million tax refund from the IRS, according to their own shareholder report. Well, maybe before you start cutting the Social Security Administration or Pell Grants for college students, maybe, you might want to ask the most profitable corporation in America to start paying some federal income tax. And on it goes. So my point, Mr. President, is now is the moment when we have got to do the right thing for working families in America, and that is to understand that there's a lot of pain out there. A lot of people are hurting. This recession has taken a very heavy toll. And in the middle of these tough times, you don't stick a knife into people and make it even worse. So we have got to move to a deficit reduction. I believe that. But I believe you don't do it on the backs of the sick, the elderly, the poor, and the most vulnerable people in this country. I think we need a little bit of shared sacrifice here, and some of the wealthiest people in this country are going to have to play their part in deficit reduction as well. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor, and I guess I won't yield the floor here. Okay, what do we got? Mr. President, on behalf of the Majority Leader, there will be no further roll call votes today. The next roll call vote is expected on Monday at 5:30 p.m. And with that, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the